Welcome to a random conversation on business, politics, and governance concerning the region and the continent of Africa. Today I'm joined by Tumsime Derrick, a man I consider of many colors and faces. As an advocate, I find him quite interesting, and I find it wonderful to have him on this conversation because it carries a lot of weight for us to be here, touching several aspects and those that I imagine definitely and events across the continent.
Thank you,
Derrick,
Joshua.
you're welcome.
Thank you, Joshua, for the introduction. That was quite a wholesome. What are we discussing?
It's definitely interesting. We call it a random conversation. I want to invite you for us to focus our minds on democratic governance on the African continent.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that you're a man of many faces, I've known you to be interested in arts as a lawyer. That is quite interesting, but I've also found you interested in the governance of Africa.
Yes.
So that's the reason I'm calling you one of these many faces, which could be interesting to hear your perspective on democratic governance on the continent of Africa. With the many elections that are coming up in the different parts of the continent, we have definitely South Africa, you have Uganda also 2026, Rwanda. Along the way you have Chad, Senegal, which has been quite significant, just finished its election. So all this, what does it mean to you? What's your take on the elections that are coming up?
Okay, so first of all, electoral democracy in Africa has been growing for quite some time. I cannot say Africa is a growing concern of democracy, electoral democracy, per se. But there is a semblance of holding elections now and then after a given period of time. Usually you find that there's a presidential term of 5 years, and after that you have an election. Or like in Rwanda, you have 7 years, then an election. Of course, each country has its unique processes in terms of how they elect their leaders, but also they have unique history.
Sure.
Yes, that shapes the electoral democracy and the levels of leadership in which they elect their leaders. Yes, so quite a number of activity as far as electoral processes are concerned in Africa. Senegal has just come out of the election. Maybe you could give us a bit of the dynamics of that election. It was really interesting, where you have some candidates incarcerated, then they are released, and then they win an election.
Yes, definitely Senegal, for me, gave a clear indication. First of all, when you look at the statistics on the continent of Africa, you see that we have a high number of young people on the continent of Africa.
Yeah.
Now, specifically for a country like Senegal, where you have the majority of young people coming out and demanding this. But significantly is that the Senegal election, Senegal has always been looked at as one of the democratic countries on the continent, for a long time.
Yes.
But this particular election happened in a manner that there was an attempt to amend the constitution.
Yes, to extend the presidential
Yes. So
term limits from 2 terms to 3.
That brought in a high contestation,
Yes.
which took a long time by the opposition protesting the elections.
Yes.
A long time shutting down.
I think it was a situation of where history repeats itself, because previously, before Macky Sall took over power, there was a semblance also to extend the previous presidential term.
Absolutely.
I think Abdoulaye Wade, if I remember,
Yes.
who had ruled Senegal for some good time.
Then that is something that we also need to look at as a continent, but specifically for me now, when that happened, I happened to know that there was, I think, a discussion because of the fears that are happening within the entire region.
Yes.
Sahel, on a larger context, it's West Africa. Yes, Senegal is on the western part, but when you look,
And we have had several coups.
yes, you have had coups within, and some countries have gone as far as withdrawing their membership from ECOWAS, which are in these countries that are within the Sahel. So the fear was that could that be another destabilizing factor within the region that is already at stake? Where
and I think also ECOWAS has been very straightforward as far as electoral democracy is concerned. To the extent in where there have been attempts by either the army to to subvert the will of the people, there was, I think I remember one time Nigeria saying it would lead a mission in one of the countries to enforce the will of the people through an election that had happened previously.
Definitely, that would have been interesting.
Could that have caused some countries to step out of ECOWAS because they feel like they are no longer up to the standard of ECOWAS, or ECOWAS is no longer serving the interest of the leaders, not just the people now? I
think for those that stepped outside, that withdrew their membership or that were suspended, actually some were suspended. I think majority of those that are out were suspended from ECOWAS because of especially the coups that happened.
Yes.
Now, the uniqueness of that is that it also returns back to nation sovereignty, discussing a state and appreciating that what is the interest of the people. Is the interest of the people ECOWAS, or they are defining their own interest going forward?
Yes.
Now that is where you will start to see that uniqueness within these particular countries where coups have happened, they have happened and they are being led by young people, and there is also a dynamic interest by the West and Russia. So Russia's push, specifically trying to expand its influence in that particular region, speaks a lot about also the Western interest. But specifically the French who were expelled by many of these.
Yes,
but to return to Senegal, the Senegalese election gave Africa a certain picture of where the people wake up and they tell themselves they were determined to defend our democracy.
Yes.
And indeed they defended that.
And also protect the vote.
Exactly.
Yes.
Now, whether the electoral process itself was free and fair is a debate we can happen.
Yes.
But you see,
when
you win and they hand over to you, it is hard for you to say that what? You were rigged because now you're in charge.
Yes.
I only had that, I think, recently from Pakistan, where the one who had been declared, I think, stepped down and said that the state rigged for him.
Oh,
State machinery, if I remember right. So I just need to be sure, but at least I remember him, I think he withdrew and was saying such statement. So that was a unique event.
Yeah.
When you see a young man in Senegal going 10 days to an election and winning it, it speaks a lot. For me, it's not just about that there was an electoral process and people voted against this. It was a protest.
Wow.
This protest can still happen to this young man. However, the current prime minister that was appointed in Senegal was the key figure that should have led actually this entire...
the main opposition figure.
Yes, was the main opposition figure. For him to be able to not have the opportunity to appear on that ballot because he was in jail over certain charges that were the state that were brought against him is what limited him. So at the end of the day, they looked for another new face that would stand in and bring in. That's why even the posters, you see that still this the main opposition figure was on the posters. So the voting was mainly...
It seems the election was more of a protest vote by the people.
Yes.
And the people also protected their vote. Are we seeing a trajectory where the electorates in Africa are now more involved in an election? They not just vote and go away, but they vote but also protect the vote, but also are involved in processes to count, to ensure there is a track record of transparency, which in my view, I would think that means if the people have to be involved, yet they delegated some of these powers to electoral governance institutions like electoral commissions to ensure that their will is actually reflected in the final outcome of the election. Is this a new trend we are going to see where the people are going to rise up and do a protest vote in terms of to make these institutions work by ensuring that they protect their will?
I think the uniqueness also comes into some of these regions when you understand that it's not a one shoe fit for every country on the continent. Africa is very dynamic in how elections are managed in each country. For example, when you look at our own region, East Africa here, it is very unique. You're going to find Kenya's electoral process is very unique from Uganda.
That's true.
Tanzanian electoral process is very unique in nature. Democratic Republic of Congo is very unique. Rwanda is very unique. So all this kind speaks into. Then generally speaking, when you look at, say, reports by, say, the Ibrahim Mo Foundation on Governance, the index, you start to see which countries are doing better in terms of democratic electoral governance, democratic governance. You see West Africa in certain aspects is doing far much better, even when we have improved through that along the way. But currently, I think the latest reports have been showing that there is a lot of shrinking civic space that is limiting and frustrating the participation of the opposition members and even civil society and the citizens generally in electoral democracy.
Yes.
So that points to a lot. Now, coming as to whether this we are going to see such happen across the continent, I think then the question would come at what extent are we civically engaged as a society in the different countries, because in that society, for people to wake up and defend and protest, they understand it is their right and they are able to stand out. But also the other institutions, say, that are involved in electoral democracy, such as security institutions and all this, they understand their mandate not to frustrate the will of the people, not to frustrate their citizen participation in electoral processes. Such is what then you start to come down to look at in the different countries.
The thing is, most of these electoral democracies in Africa, in quotes, are fragile states.
Definitely.
Some of them are like you've heard, there are coups happening across the Sahel region. The other context of the matter would be, and help us understand this, election security. How do you guarantee a free, fair election in such an environment? What role is played by the state security agencies already that are involved in some internal fights? I'll give you an example. In the DRC last year, there is a region that did not vote. Now, how do we factor in, because there was instability in certain parts of DRC,
sure,
as we are all aware, so some regions were left out, did not vote. Then how do you factor in that the will of the people is actually reflected, given in certain places that election workers are intimidated, ballots and all the things are confiscated, and also falsification of results in such cases. Now, to what extent does election security, how crucial is it in ensuring that the will of the people is reflected?
Election security is very, very important, because one, it's not limited, because looking at election security, look at it from an election cycle to appreciate that at what point, at every point, you need security to happen. But security is not limited to, say, what we consider as military, the armed forces and all this. There is also what you look at purely, say, digital security, apparently, because then there is also many election management bodies are adapting to this kind
digital
of
technologies.
Yes, technologies. So it's important for you now to come down and say, okay, now when we are talking about election security, we are talking about guaranteeing the safety of the citizens to participate in these elections without any fear that they will be intimidated, without any fear that their will be subverted. If that is there, then you will be certain that people are sure there is a transparent process, they are sure, but also the independence of these institutions, how, like you said at the beginning, that there is a very big uniqueness on the African continent. Every nation, every state has a uniqueness of how it has, what I would say, structured its security. If the security has been structured towards probably individual leaders, then they are always probably going to see such. It is only interesting that we need to maybe also understand some of these leaders that have been in power for a long time, most of them who came through revolutions, most of them who came through some of these wars, they have also along the way adopted away from their methods and adapted to electoral democracy because they want to be accepted. And like you point out, Sahel itself, where there is a lot of conflict, they might not be holding elections right now, but you're going to see that along the way, they're also recognizing the fact that for acceptance beyond their countries, international acceptance, they want to adopt an electoral process. The question, like you state, is security able and willing to stand as an institution that protects the mandate of the people, not the mandate of the leader just. That is something that will continue to be contested, especially depending on the democratic, probably what levels of that country. How much do people participate? The independence of these institutions. Are they able to stand and say no where they feel we cannot do this? You remember in Zimbabwe what happened? The army took over. So this is so some of these things start to play out, and it's something that we keep studying. I think the dynamics in each and
the
every
army took over after Mugabe had won the election. So that brings me to the question of incumbency. Is incumbency still a big deal in African elections? And has, to a larger extent, some people argue that incumbency has actually, whenever there is an incumbent in the election, the quality of that election deteriorates because they already have an upper hand in terms of resources they deploy, in terms of institutions of the state available to them. Now we are going into elections. Rwanda is going into election next year, and President Paul Kagame has already been endorsed by his party, the RPF, to represent them in that election. And some opposition parties have also endorsed President Kagame. South Sudan, as far as the revitalized peace agreement is concerned, they are supposed to be going into an election, and already their voices and all indicators that, for all intents and purposes, Salva Kiir will appear on that ballot paper. Does the incumbency still have a way to affect how these elections are run? And do you think in those two electoral democracies I've mentioned, what are the chances that the elections will be free and fair if the incumbents I've mentioned are actually participating?
Definitely, the incumbency, the power of incumbency cannot be taken as on a light note. One, you're talking about state machinery that is at the disposal of the leaders at that time. You're talking of, by virtue of the structure of the institutions we are talking about, you have security, you have resources at your disposal, you have, you are the sole person appointing most of these, even the people who manage elections. So the election management team, body itself, you appoint it. So that's the structure we are talking about. The uniqueness definitely is per country, but the ones you've talked about, who is appointing the election management teams? It is the ones in charge. When you're talking about security, who is managing this security? Now, the uniqueness that again you point to between, say, a country like Rwanda and South Sudan is that with Rwanda, they have managed to integrate and they have one army, strictly. While in South Sudan, you continue to see that there are different army factions.
Groups,
militia groups, the factions that are happening. That in itself puts the country at stake in terms of...
And some of these control some regions.
So you can tell that in areas where you have a certain faction aligned to a certain political candidate controlling that faction, that area, you're most probably going to see them trying to influence an election there. Because they have the power, they can do anything to try and turn it around. That's happened actually in DRC Congo, like you pointed out. In some places, the rebels took over the machines and they said you're not going to vote. And so this is something that we need to not indeed take on a light note, that the power of incumbency is very important. Not important to the society, but it influences most likely the outcome of an election by virtue of the structure of that nation.
Thank you, Joshua. That has been it on the Random Conversations on politics, governance, and business in Africa. Please subscribe to our channel.
Thank you. We look forward to you joining us on many more Random Conversations on Africa. Thank you.